I'm a Diet Coke person, not a Diet Pepsi person.
Diet Cokes, can you imagine you use Coke to clean battery terminals.
I know.
Can you imagine what that does to your...
But have you ever taken a 2-liter bottle of Diet Coke and put Mentos
Oh.
in it?
I've seen it done.
Yeah.
I've done it. It's fun.
It is.
Yes.
Alrighty.
It'd be something to entertain your grandkids with.
That's true. Granddaughter probably like that.
I can't think of the name of the show, but it typically preceded Mythbusters on cable, and they would take things like that and do it in like super slow motion.
Oh, yeah?
Like seeing a bullet or an arrow hitting a balloon, and you watch it peel back. I mean, that they did the Mentos thing.
You have to try it. It's fun.
It was
Do it outside.
real impressive.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah.
I missed it.
Outside, make sure you use diet.
Yeah.
Because if you use real Coke, it'll be sticky everywhere. Diet Coke is not sticky because there's no sugar.
That's cool.
Good to know.
You get
Yeah.
a stack of them,
Mhm.
and you just, and
Can
you
we do
gotta,
it in their
you gotta
house?
quit.
It's
And
very
then
fun.
hold it outside, you can't do that. You could do it in the house.
Let's do it in their house.
Yeah.
Maybe for the next meeting, we'll have to do that. Bring some Diet Coke and Mentos. So.
I made a great video.
It
Yeah.
would.
Yeah.
Make our meetings a little more exciting. Although Sean is very exciting in his presentation. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeanette Wurzbicki. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio Mid-Eastern Governments Association. And following the pandemic, or during the pandemic, we received funding from the U.S. Economic Development Administration to help our region with its economic recovery from the pandemic. And one of the things I think we all realized was how critical broadband is to our residents, to our businesses, and to our children for remote learning purposes. And most of our region is unserved or underserved by reliable, high-speed broadband. So using those funds from the Economic Development Administration, we retained Reid Consulting to do a broadband feasibility study for our region. They are in the process of finishing up their final report, but we wanted to reach out to all of our stakeholders in each of our counties to give them an update on some of the work that we've done so far, or that Reid Consulting has done so far. And then to get your input on additional needs. What we hope is that this is going to be a planning tool for you to work with us and ISPs in the future on potential funding opportunities to expand broadband into those unserved or underserved areas. So with that brief introduction, I'd like to introduce Sean O'Malley from Reid Consulting Group, and he's going to provide an update to you. For those of you that have been at many of our meetings, some of the initial material may be a little bit repetitive, but then we get into the details about Guernsey County and some specifics. We want your input into the areas that we've shown as unserved or underserved, and we're looking for comments from those that may be participating on Facebook or who will be viewing this video on YouTube after the presentation. So with that, please join me in welcoming Sean.
Thanks, Jeanette. I'm pretty sure you all probably saw me earlier on, though we might have to put a little cardboard box around me, and I should be kind of jerky, and then maybe I would look familiar from the Zoom meeting from probably a year or so ago. As Jeanette said, some of this, if you were in that meeting, some of this is going to sound familiar, but like we probably have new folks on the stream, and I want to make sure that they have all the context so that they're not wondering what this stuff is. I'll define some terms for them as I go through. Go, mouse. There we go. Before I get into the content, I do want to thank Omega for helping fund this. We're also working with the other development districts around the region, Buckeye Hills, OVRDC, and Eastgate. We also have other funding partners across the state. Without these folks, this would not be possible. This is important work. We're glad to be able to do it. Apologies for the Bengals reference if I have Steelers or Cleveland fans here. Joey Burrow's a hometown boy. He went to high school with my kids, so I feel like I can slip that in there. But we do need to position ourselves for the win here. And the way to do that is to identify where we need broadband and then prioritize which areas we want to focus on. Find funding for it, secure that funding. And then what's really going to be important in the next couple of years, track that funding and make sure that the agencies enforce it. As I'll mention later in this presentation, sometimes, especially the federal government, has not been good about holding providers accountable for the money they receive. And we want to make sure that doesn't happen again. So I'm going to start at a state level, and then I will come down to the region, and then down to Guernsey County itself. So at the state level, it's a pretty stark picture. The dark red and the orange are areas that are unserved according to the FCC's current standards. The red is below 10 megabits per second, so that's quite slow for current standards. The orange is below 25 megabits per second download. And then all of those yellow and the light green areas, now with the new legislation that just got signed for the Infrastructure Act, those are considered underserved. So it's almost the whole state. You just have those patches, and like you can see a lot in Cincinnati, there's little dots in Columbus, stuff up in Cleveland, Akron, Canton area. If we zoomed in more on the areas that have the light green, there usually would be a dot or two of the dark green in there, but for the most part, if you look at the just underserved, almost the whole state is eligible for help. We got this information partly based on over 9 million consumer speed tests. So if you have ever gone online to say, how fast is my internet, you Google the word speed test, you'll get the tool from a company called Ookla, usually. They're the biggest company that does this. The state was really smart. They licensed the data from Ookla for 1.5 years worth of historical data and current data in the state, and then they shared that with us, so we were able to use that to create updated maps. That's where this mapping comes from. We would love to have more people continue to complete speed tests. There's a campaign out on the connectingappalachia.org website and real simple instructions on how to do this. The more results we have, the better, and it doesn't just have to be bad. Like, we would actually prefer people do it no matter what. We want to see the good results too, so it's an accurate picture on the ground. So look at the numbers real quick. Put a highlight on there to easier to see the ones, the unserved areas. You're looking at about 2/3 of the state if you go by physical area where people live. If you go by households, it's about 800,000. The FCC has in the past claimed it was only 200,000 households. They have since admitted they're wrong, that their maps were inaccurate and they didn't show enough of the problem. So they're going through to fix their maps. They're moving at the speed of federal government, so we're not sure that's going to happen super quickly. They are at least starting to solicit some information. If you ask Microsoft, this is about 2 million households that don't have broadband in Ohio. The problem pretty much can be blamed on population density. When you look at a city like Columbus, you've got about 1,500 households per square mile. That's really good density for an internet provider to be able to make their money back if they invest in installing fiber optic or cable in there. Even when you get down to a small city like McConnellsville, you're still pushing 500 households per square mile, and that's still enough for a provider to just come in, wire things up, and they know they can make their investment back because they'll have enough subscribers. It's when you get down into what we call the rural expanse that it becomes challenging. You're getting below 2% the density of Columbus, 26 households per square mile for like all of Meigs County. Some of the smaller townships are pushing below 20, some of them are even below 10. You might have 5 or 6 households per square mile. You're just never going to find an internet provider who's willing to spend their own money to run the infrastructure into those areas to serve those folks, because they just won't make it back given the number of subscribers that they can get. This isn't a new issue. It's pushing a century now. Back in the Depression era, we had the Communications Act. I always like to quote this line: all people in the United States shall have access to rapid, efficient, nationwide communication service with adequate facilities and reasonable charges. Now, they were talking about old school landline telephones back then. Now, broadband, it makes the same sense. That still applies. And in fact, since 1990, there's been about $100 billion spent by the FCC, given mostly to the big telecommunications companies, supposedly to fix this problem. I don't know about you, but when I look out around me, the problem's still there. It hasn't been fixed. This is some of that money I said wasn't real well spent or well tracked. So I like to compare this to road maintenance. If you stop maintaining your roads for a couple of years, you're going to get a lot of potholes. Some of them are going to be car eaters. If you stop maintaining your roads for a couple of decades, you're back to a Jeep track or a four-wheeler track, and it's going to be real hard to drive on that. That's pretty much what we've got with our internet infrastructure around here right now. Most of the internet in rural Ohio is still getting carried over the old copper phone lines that were installed as part of that Communications Act stuff. Most of them were done about a half a century ago. It was great technology at the time. If you maintain it, it's still pretty decent technology. Unfortunately, it hasn't been maintained for the last 15 to 20 years, and 30 years is about as long as it's going to last if you don't update it. People have been dropping their landline services, so the phone companies just don't see it worth their while to invest in this to fix it. So they're just letting it go. And things don't work right anymore. A lot of people can't even get landline service anymore. To stick with the roads for a minute, if you're going to update things, if you're going to build a road, if you're getting federal funding for it or state funding, there are tons of specs you got to follow. It printed out, it's about this thick. They're telling you all of the different materials you're allowed to use, how many different layers you have, how they're bound together. You have to meet all that stuff if you're going to get the funding. Broadband, not so much. They typically just give you a speed target and say, we don't care how you meet it, just meet that speed target. And there's no sense about, is this going to last or is this going to be outdated in 5 years? To give you a sense of why this matters, the internet was around long. The web was invented in around 1990. And since then, pretty much, we have seen demand go up tenfold every decade. You started out down just around 100K per second back in 1990s. By 2000, that was up to a megabit per second if you lived in a well-served area. By 2010, when Zoom first came onto the scene as a company, if you lived in a well-served area, you were expecting about 10 megabits down. That 25.3 number that I was quoting for the FCC is what they say currently means you don't have broadband. That was 2012. That's when it was relevant for a well-served area. Today, in cities, you can expect to get 100 megabits down, pretty much. Where are we headed after this? Your guess is as good as mine, but I'm pretty sure this demand trend is going to continue. We're seeing a lot of VR happening now. Also, all of the things that came in with the pandemic, work from home, telehealth, remote learning, that stuff is not going away. It's very clear that that works, and the model has changed. So we can pretty much expect this to continue. Is it going to make it all the way out to 100 gigs in 2050? Maybe not. It might top out more somewhere in the 10 gig range, but already folks are buying gigabit packages in a lot of places. Current technologies, DSL, fixed wireless, satellite, they all top out at about 100 megabits, so they're okay right now. They'll be good for probably another 5 to 10 years. After that, they're going to have trouble keeping up. Cable modems right now average around a gigabit per second for download. I am seeing some of the companies start to offer 2 gigabit plans, but still their upload speeds are not good. The whole cable infrastructure for cable TV was built on the assumption that everybody's consuming things. They're watching TV, and then when they started doing internet access, they figured you were streaming, you were pulling stuff down, browsing the web, you weren't actually creating content and sending it back out. Now with remote work, telehealth, things like that, it's just as important to be able to send video back out as it is to get it in. And their technologies can't keep up. They run into trouble even delivering 20 megs up. They're often more like 10. And a lot of the plans now, they don't even tell you anymore, like they don't even promise an upload speed. They just say 200 megabits, and its download is what they're quoting. The only technology right now that can keep up with these really high speeds is fiber. There are fiber networks that already run at 100 plus gigabits, so it's capable of doing that. And this is infrastructure. It's like a sewer system. You don't want to have to come back 5 years from now and dig everybody's yard up again because the pipes are too small. So we recommend planning a good 3 to 4 decades out. That's how long fiber can last. So you want to be able to meet whatever you put in now should be able to meet the demand in 2050 rather than just in 2030 or 2025. Now that said, the next 5 years, don't ignore it. If you can find a provider with a technology that's quick to deploy like fixed wireless who's willing to do the work and you can encourage them with some subsidy, definitely do it. It's worthwhile. It will bring relief to a lot of people immediately, and it will last for 5 to 10 years for sure. And technology increases on the wireless side too, so that they may improve, and it'll also be a competitive option, so that whatever provider comes in, if they do wirelines, there'll be an option for people to go and use the wireless if they don't like the quality from the wireline provider. So I'm talking a lot about fiber here, and I'll be showing some budget numbers for the county later, and I wanted to give you some sense of my assumptions about what I'm recommending for a fiber network, because not all fiber is the same. There's a few costs you need to think about. First, you need to think about getting your infrastructure ready to take the fiber. The industry calls it make ready because you're making utility poles ready to have extra cables added to them. That can run between $30,000 and $60,000 a mile. Some rural co-ops, electric co-ops, can come in below that. But on average, this is about where you end up falling for that. And then on top of that, you have to buy the fiber and pay the labor to actually put it in. That's another $30,000 to $40,000 a mile. With inflation next year, that could be up significantly if the trends continue right now. But total right now, you'd be looking at $60,000 to $100,000 per mile. The projections we did for the budget numbers assumed $81,000 a mile, kind of put it right in the middle. And if things come in cheaper, great. But we wanted to be conservative so that you didn't end up getting sticker shock if a project actually happened. We are recommending using what they call high strand count fiber. Basically, you have fiber cables. Some of them, you can get ones called drop cables that are real cheap. They're inexpensive to get. They're real lightweight. They're easy to string. They only have a handful of strands in them, and each strand, typically, you need to have a strand for each house you're serving. Out in the rural expanse where there aren't many houses right now, you could get away with building an entire network just out of drop cables, even your backbone that runs along the road. It wouldn't cost nearly as what we're quoting here, but it has a couple issues. One, you would run out of capacity if more houses started getting built. And when word got out that there was fiber available, that's one of the things that prevents people from buying houses in our area often is they're like, what's the internet like? Oh, I can't get any? I'll look somewhere else. So it could run out of capacity very quickly. So we're recommending using cables that have a whole bunch of strands in them, so there'll be enough capacity for now, as well as at least 50% overhead for the future. And then if cell providers wanted to build towers in the area, you'd be able to use that same fiber network to feed those cell towers. We also recommend high quality armored cable. Squirrels love fiber. They love it even more than power lines, maybe because they don't die when they bite into it. But if you have that inexpensive fiber cable, when they chew through the outside, sometimes they'll go right into the glass fibers, and then you'll have an outage and you'll have to go in and replace that section. Or even if they don't chew all the way to the glass, they break the coating so that water can get in and it messes the cable up eventually. They make double armored cable that we recommend using, so they chew through the outside and then they hit a layer of like Kevlar. They don't like what that feels on their teeth, and they stop. And then there's another insulation layer under that Kevlar so that the rain can't get in, so the cable's still good. We're assuming, like I said above, that you're putting this on the utility poles. If you bury fiber around here, you tend to hit a lot of bedrock pretty close to the surface, so you end up having to use really expensive boring equipment where you have to jump up onto the poles and then go back down underground again. So we figure that adds $10,000 to $50,000 per mile if you're going to bury with good conduit. Why does this cost so much? You've probably seen these whenever you drive around. This is the classic utility pole setup. So up top here, you got the higher voltage lines, you've got a transformer in the middle, and then your lower voltage lines in between, drop cable running over the house to give them their AC power. And then down here in this space, these fat lines with those splice cables on them, that's the communication space. That's the existing phone lines, and oftentimes if you're in an area that has good service, that's where the cable company runs their lines. They have minimum clearances that you have to observe, like you can't build up into this space anymore because they don't want communications techs getting near the electrical lines because they don't want people getting fried, and they're not trained to be up there, or you would have to end up turning the power off for everyone anytime you need to maintain the communications cables. There's also a minimum clearance down from the ground. So when you add another line, you might still be above the minimum clearance if you're in a flat area, but with all of our lovely hills around here, you add another line, oftentimes with the undulations, you've exceeded the minimum clearance, and you end up having to put a taller pole in, and that's not cheap, so you can raise everything up. Sometimes it's just, even if the poles are tall enough, they're just too old, and when the engineers look at them, they say, hey, we can't put another cable on here, you're going to break the pole. It's usually not because of the cable itself, because fiber is really light. It's the ice that you get in the winter. When you build up ice on a cable in the winter, or a lot of wind load, you'll break the pole, so they end up having to replace it. So that's why make ready is so expensive. With that in mind, now let's start zooming in closer. So here's the Omega District with all of the counties. We've got the color coding again. Remember, the dark red is the slowest speeds. The orange is still slow and below the minimum. And then when you get into the greens, it's better served. You're looking at almost 80% of the acreage in the area that has population on it, and a third of the households are not served right now. Superimpose on here. Quick moment to do a definition for you. This is called middle mile fiber that I'm showing you now. The blue lines are existing. That's already out there. Any provider who wants to can lease capacity on it. The pink lines in some of these counties are ones that we suggest building if money comes available to do middle mile. And for those of you who don't know the industry term, middle mile fiber is the stuff that sits in the middle, in between all of the runs that would go down the roads and the households and the internet providers, central offices, and then the big internet pipelines. Without middle mile, you can't do what they call the last mile, which is all of the connections that we're trying to get funded to be able to actually reach neighborhoods. But middle mile isn't enough by itself. Guernsey's in pretty good condition with middle mile. There's a lot of existing open middle mile that's enough to be able to cover the area with last mile if people want to connect to it. So that's a good sign. Here's a simplified version of the district. All of the orange is areas that are unserved according to the FCC. The white stuff has service. We just made it white so that it's not going to be visually intrusive. There was some federal funding that was made available back in 2020 at the end of the year. It was called the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, RDOF for short. Federal agencies love their acronyms, so we turned them into a word. There were a number of providers that won funding. So far, it only looks like in Ohio that Charter is one of the few companies that's actually going to follow through and actually do the work. Remember, I talked about money needing to be tracked and accountable. There's not a whole lot of teeth in the RDOF program, so it was very easy to bid on it. Charter, though, seems to be following through on it. Jeanette actually has said that they have run connectivity down her street already. So they are doing it even though some of that money hasn't been released by the FCC yet. So good sign there. This won't affect Guernsey this time, but with the first round of state funding, Rural Electric Co-op, South Central Power, won a whole bunch of territory in neighboring counties. And all of that's going to end up, if their board of directors approves accepting the grant, I think they're meeting in a couple of weeks, they'll be fiber to the home throughout all of that purple territory. And there will be more phases of this, and if South Central Power has a good experience with doing this, that will probably, I would think that will embolden other rural co-ops to take the risk. Because it is a financial risk for a rural electric co-op to get into the broadband business. But we think they'll do well with it. Guernsey did have a little bit of money awarded from House Bill 2. It was Windstream, which was the provider. We don't have their territory yet. We represented South Central Power in their application, which is why we know what their territory looks like for where they were going to do the grant work. Broadband Ohio, once they get done with all the challenges on the addresses and get the final address list out, they'll release those publicly, and we will map all of that so that you can have another overlay on the county to see, okay, here's where Windstream's going to be serving, so we don't need necessarily to focus on there. As I said, there will be additional rounds from the state, so there'll be opportunities to get more funding. And that really is the next step, is to identify the areas you want to get funding and then take advantage of all the programs that are out here and apply for them. There's a lot of FCC money still available. They're going to have another phase of RDOF. I'm hoping that they revise it. There's been a lot of political pressure on them because the word has gotten out that the original charter of the way RDOF was put together was not very good. And so we're hearing scuttlebutt that they may revise how the money gets handed out for the next version of this. There's also the Rural 5G Fund. That's focused primarily on cell towers, which are really important here too, because you've got a lot of areas that don't even have cell coverage, let alone broadband. USDA is in the broadband business. Appalachian Regional Commission has two programs, both of which are eligible for broadband. One of them is the Power Program, the other is for distressed counties. You can apply for those. The state has got its residential broadband expansion program. That's the one that first round, I was talking about South Central Power getting that. All this money that's going to the NTIA, there's probably going to be about $1 to $1.5 billion for Ohio. from the Infrastructure Act, and then another several hundred million from the Treasury Department. That's all gonna go to Broadband Ohio, and they're gonna distribute it through this program. So that's why I'm saying there will be multiple rounds still coming through, I'm sure, for grant opportunities from the state. A couple of examples of ways to take advantage of these programs in the short term. Coshocton County took some of their, I think, a good chunk of their ARPA funds, which for, you all know what ARPA is, the folks on the stream may not. That was a COVID relief program that provided funding to townships, municipalities, sometimes county level. And one of the things it could be used for was broadband that was considered infrastructure. So Coshocton County took $5 million of their ARPA funds, pooled it together, and they put out a proposal asking for internet providers to serve unserved households in the county. Ohio TT, a fixed wireless provider, won that. They're planning on putting in 11 new towers and then putting antennas on another 10 existing structures. And Ohio TT's numbers say that they expect to be able to reach about 15,000 households, and they're offering plans up to 100 megabit speeds. They've already, I think they've gone live with one already, and they're working on others, so it's happening right now. This is one of those moves that's a really good short-term thing because fixed wireless is quick to put in. You can get it up much faster than trying to run fiber cable down every road in order to reach the same number of people. It has the longevity issues, but those aren't going to come up right away. And the technology probably will continue to get better. And if a provider does come in later and run cable, these folks are already operating. Folks know if they're happy with the service, then everyone will know that there are options. There'll be competition there. Anytime there's competition, you usually have better prices and better service. Carroll County is another example of how you can use your ARPA funds to get some coverage. They just completed a grant application with Appalachian Regional Commission. They did power grant. They'll hear back in the fall whether they got it or not. But they kicked in a little over $1 million of their ARPA funds, and then they put out an RFP for an internet provider to partner with them, because ARC always wants you to be public-private partnership, and Charter ended up winning that proposal. So Charter's kicking in another $874,000, and then they're asking ARC to match that. So it's basically a $4 million program. And if this ends up getting funded, there will be 86 miles of fiber put in. They'll reach 384 homes and 53 businesses, and that'll be really good service for them. And the numbers they were using, they were assuming 16,000 per mile for make ready, $33,000 per mile for install. I looked at the coverage, and it's in these spaces here, like these unserved areas, and a lot of those overlap with Carroll Electric, which is a rural co-op. So they might be safe in assuming that lower make ready, but some of that also overlaps with AEP territory. And we've heard from providers that AEP tends to be on the high side, like they'll quote $60,000 to $70,000 a mile when a provider comes to them for make ready. So we'll see how that comes out, but it does fall within the range. And then the internet providers kicking in $2,000 per household of their own money. Like I said, they won't know till fall if this gets done, but if you've got ARPA funds available, you can consider applying for one of these grants. Use the maps that we've produced for you that I'll be showing you in a second to be able to target in on specific areas, because ARC is all about doing, like, they're happy to do small areas. You don't have to do the whole county. Speaking of the whole county, I will switch off onto the profile now. Electronic version of this is available on the web. Omega District has them on their site, omegadistrict.org. They're also available out on the connectingappalachia.org website. Switch my...
While Sean is switching, we worked with Carroll County and the Governor's Office of Appalachia on that ARC power application. So as you go through this and identify areas that are going to be unserved or underserved, that program opens up every spring. Usually folks begin planning for those projects late December, early January, because so if you are interested, and we'll send out a reminder to you, please let us know and we'd be happy to work with you on that.
All right. So I'll step you through the maps and data that's available in Guernsey County's updated broadband profile. This one's going to look familiar if you looked at the version 1. This is essentially the same map, just with more updated speed test results from the months that were intervening between when we did version 1 and version 2. So it's color coded again, red is the worst, green is the best. About half of your households do not have the minimum 25.3, and you're looking at almost 90% of your populated area. To look at it from another perspective, many of these follow-up maps now all use the same color code. All of this kind of salmon color, that's all the unserved area, and then anything that's in white is served, because we just wanted to make that so you didn't have to be distracted by that. The blue dots on here are all business locations. And you'll see that in the served areas, you tend to have a big concentration of businesses. But you'll also notice that there are quite a few places where you've got concentrations of businesses that are not served. We also varied the size of the dots on this so that it would give you a sense for how much demand there is. We based this on Dun & Bradstreet data that Omega was able to provide for us. That gives us all of the businesses in the county, how many employees they have, where they're located, and what sector they're in, industry-wise. So the more employees you have, the bigger your dot's gonna be, because we figure you'll have more demand. If you're in a high-demand sector, we also have a multiplier to make the dot bigger for that. So for example, if you're a healthcare clinic, educational institution, a bank, an IT operation, you're gonna have a lot more broadband demand for the same number of employees than like an excavation contractor or a farm or something. That's not to say those folks down on the low end don't need broadband, they do. But if you got 50 employees in a healthcare clinic, probably all 50 of those employees are on their computers or iPads all day, doing stuff on the cloud, talking to internet servers. Whereas if you got a 50 employee construction company, you probably have 2 or 3 folks in the office all day, the rest of them are out on the job site, so you don't need as much capacity. This is a really good planning tool to be able to help narrow in on areas that are still unserved after the funding that's already been out that we want to focus on. You can combine this with the residential data so that you can get more bang for your buck. If you can find an area that has business concentration and a decent concentration of houses, that's going to be a pretty attractive area for a grant program or even just to get a provider to come into. Now this is not all 21,000 households in the county. We wouldn't be able to put that many points on there, but this is designed to give you the sense of where the population is and what the density is like. And again, the orange is the stuff that's unserved, the white is already served. We also have a map that shows you where all of the unserved roads are. The reason we do this is because if you're going to run fiber to everybody, you have to follow the roads. That's usually where the utility poles go, and for talking to utility companies, many times, like some of their pole runs right now will go up over a ridge between 2 hollers, and there's no houses on that line. They're tending to, like when they have to replace poles, they're often rerouting those to follow the roads because it's easier to maintain them when they're on roads. So all of these light lines, light black lines that are passing through all of the orange areas, those are all the unserved roads. That dark blue is the existing middle mile I was talking about earlier, so you can see where the fiber connections would happen. And this is good shorthand for how much fiber you would have to install. So if you wanted to do every single unserved household in Guernsey County, you're looking at almost 1,000 miles of fiber. So here's where the big price tag comes. And remember, there are 2 caveats on this. This is the entire county, all of its unserved space. Some of that's going to go away as Charter builds out. Some of it may go away as Windstream builds out from the state program, and if there are other grant programs that come in, that'll also drop it down. This just assumes that if you were going to do every single unserved household, ignoring all the other grant programs, this is what it would take. So total cost would be a little under 87 million. That would be 10,000, almost 11,000 households, 11.2 households per fiber mile. We figure internet providers at that density, they'd be willing to kick in about 1,700 per household of their own money. If you saw, like on that Carroll County grant, Charter was willing to kick in $2 grand a household because I think they had a slightly higher population density there. So you've got 18.7 million you could expect to come from a provider. Still got a gap of 68 million. That's where we need the grant funding agencies to step in. And once we've been able to map the state stuff, we will do an updated budget number here to show like what's remaining, do a gap analysis. Here's where the money went from RDOF. The dark blue is Charter. So as you can see already, if Charter's Charter is actually building. So if Charter ends up serving all of these dark blue areas, just visually to me, that looks like about 50% of the current unserved territory. So that's gonna knock that overall cost in half for serving the remaining territory. This lighter blue is Mercury Wireless. That looks like a pretty contiguous territory there, but Mercury Wireless statewide did not win very good territory. They got like a shotgun blast if you just like shot a map of the state with birdshot. Little dots here and there. That's really hard to do if you're trying to build a fiber network, so we are thinking that they're probably not gonna do the work. They didn't challenge any of the addresses that were proposed in their territory for the state. They have not talked to any utility providers that we know of about detaching to their poles, so probably they're gonna give that money back to the FCC and not do the work. So we're assuming that this will become, or will remain eligible for grants. The state did allow people to apply to go over that territory, so we expect that to continue. I'm not gonna read you our methodology here. If you're interested in it, you can dig into it on either the printout you have or on the online version. But we wanted to be real clear about how we did this, explain all of the numbers and how we calculated them, so that folks could trust that the maps are accurate. If you want to take a moment, when I was talking about the business index, in here is the list of the industry sectors and how we rated them. So healthcare, education, TCOM, banking, those are the really big consumers. You're still up there pretty high with like consulting firms, professional, that's what they call professional services, publishing, hospitality. Hotels need pretty good broadband because they got so many people using Wi-Fi while they're in their rooms. When you get down into the low demand areas, it's things like farming, hunting and fishing operations, mining, contractors, things like that. So the smaller that number, the smaller the dot was when we did the business analysis. I won't go over all of this again because I already explained it, but we have a detailed explanation here of how we estimated all of these costs and how much fiber that we thought we would need. Explanations on overhead versus underground. What it costs to pass, which is basically getting the fiber down the road past all the houses. So anytime you hear that, when you're saying passing a household, that means you're making it so you could serve them, rather than passing them by and not serving them. Simplified version of that demand graphic, that can be really useful when if you're talking to a funding agency that wants to question why you're specifying what you are as far as capacity. Say, we're building for the future, not just for now. And we just have a breakdown on the map of how we put that budget together. This is a good time to be dealing with broadband. I have never seen a time where there has been this much funding available. The state agency, Broadband Ohio, we've been really impressed with them. Within 2 weeks, I think, of when House Bill 2 was signed, they had gotten their website up and running, their office was up and running, and they were soliciting applications for that first round of the grant program. They have been really aggressive with their timelines, and they have met all their timelines so far. And the way there are, like the requirements they have in these grants, they are holding the providers much more accountable than the federal agencies were doing. If you challenged an address, because like basically a provider could apply for state funding and say, here's my spreadsheet with like all the addresses in Guernsey that I want to serve. And then Charter could come back and say, well, we're in Guernsey, oh hey, these 800 addresses over here, we're going to serve them, we're planning on running cable down their street sometime in the future. You can't give them funding for this, we don't want a competitor there. If they win that challenge, they're basically signing a contract with the state saying that they will put that service in within 2 years, which is really good for all that RDOF stuff, because Charter they defended all their RDOF winnings. So all of that space I showed you of Guernsey that was in dark blue, if anybody applied for state funding in there, Charter said, no, we're doing it under RDOF. And RDOF has a 10-year timeline, so now Charter has committed to doing it in 2 years instead of 10 years, so that's a good sign. Broadband Ohio is also going address by address instead of like census block. A lot of the federal programs, you could serve a single household in a census block that has 30 households, and then you could color that whole thing green and say, hey, we served the whole census block. Well, no, you didn't. The state is going address by address. You have to submit a massive spreadsheet with all of the addresses, and then they map them, and then they're gonna come back later and say, okay, we're gonna spot check you to make sure that there's actually, the technology you said was gonna be there is running down that road past that address. So I'm very optimistic right now. This is a good time to be applying for broadband funding. At this point, I'll be happy to take any questions, online or in the room.
The unfunded area, especially looking to anticipation of Mercury Wireless not moving forward on it. How would that end up being funded? Would that come out of the Ohio Residential Broadband Expansion Program, or is there a redistribution of RDOF money, or how does that work?
There's a couple of possibilities. There eventually is going to be some sort of, whether it's a redistribution or whether it's just the next round of distribution, there will be another round of RDOF. So that's a possibility, but the FCC tends to move slowly, so that's probably not going to happen immediately. Like the first round, the auction ended in December 2020, and they're just now starting to release the funds. So that kind of gives you a sense for how fast they move there. The Ohio Broadband Expansion Grant Program, yeah, that's a possibility. They are allowing people to apply over, like Mercury Wireless and Connect Everyone and LTD Broadband, like the other providers who won in this region. They're not disqualifying them. It also could be things like an ARC grant, like an ARC Power grant. Like if you look on the map and decide that, like, I remember, like, I think I remember there were a lot of unserved businesses maybe in here. So like, maybe you say, well, we want to just go for a grant from an ARC Power grant in this area, because the ARC Power they're big on economic development. You could apply in there, and like this would not disqualify you from that section. Like they would be willing to fund onto that, and you could build over that. And if Mercury Wireless ended up doing the work eventually, better for the region, because then you've got competing providers in there.
And if you are interested in the ARC Power grant, keep in mind, agribusiness is a business. In Carroll County, we worked with the auditor's website to identify where all the farms were in those areas. And then also, a lot of people have businesses out of their homes. That's also, a business. And in Carroll County, reached out to a lot of folks so that we had documentation that they were indeed operating a business out of their home.
Yeah, I would suggest, like, one thing is, like, don't be dissuaded by the size of the entire county budget for doing this. Like, think about zeroing in on specific areas, making them to a more manageable size, something that is more likely to get funded from, like, smaller programs sometimes. Or also, like, if you have ARPA funds available, like, even if it's not that much, like, it's kind of weird to say $1 million, drop in the bucket. Well, it's dropping the bucket compared to an $80 million cost. But even like 500,000, if you kick in 500,000 to some of these grants where they'll match things, and then you bring in an inter-provider, that makes it worth their while, because they're like, okay, there's 500,000 coming from the county, there's another like $1.5 million coming from the grant program. Yeah, we're willing to kick in $1 million ourselves, and then all of a sudden you're on a scale of being able to cover like a good chunk of unserved territory.
You mentioned the rural 5G fund. How does that come into play? Because we've got two horribly underserved communities, one in the extreme southwest corner with Cumberland and the southeast corner with Quaker City, that are essentially cellular black holes. What process can be followed to try to put something together? Commissioner Marlin did a lot of legwork to get a lot of means to identify the need, so far as letters of support and this is for Cumberland, for municipal officials as well as state legislators, and took them to Verizon, but they said it just wasn't a possibility.
Yeah.
I just wonder what tools we have available.
What you may want to consider is doing filings directly with the FCC. with those types of, like, those statements of like where the need is and the letters of support, because the earlier parts of the Rural 5G Fund, essentially the FCC was put out bids, and then I think AT&T won the contract at one point for one round of that. And so AT&T was supposed to go out and start expanding towers. And was it one of our other meetings, or maybe it was one of the meetings I think it was in with you, where there was an AT&T, or maybe it was another district. It was in this region. There was an AT&T rep there, and they were sort of bragging on the fact that they were going to start building towers. I haven't seen any yet, but that's where, like, poking the FCC and actually filing something that then they're required to put on their website for public download can help make them act when they start getting pressure from.
I actually talked to AT&T and I never heard back from them.
Yeah.
I give them everything that I give Verizon, and I never even heard back from the rep. I got tired of tracking her down, but
Yeah, I think agency level pressure is where, like, where to bring the pressure to bear now is like with the FCC, especially because they're kind of on the defensive right now because they got, like, shown up that you didn't map this stuff right and you've been ignoring the problem. And there's, with the pandemic response, there's a lot of political will at the moment to make them do better. So getting some letters coming in with these issues could make a difference.
well, I'll look into that.
And I think too, both Cumberland and Quaker City would be a good ARC power application, so that may be something we would want to get together with you on maybe in November, December, to start planning for that.
And sometimes, like the one of the reasons Verizon might have said, oh, we can't do that, is that there wasn't any fiber infrastructure there already that they could connect their towers to.
We were 6 miles shy.
Yeah, so, like, if you had an ARC grant that was doing broadband, you're running the infrastructure to get broadband to serve the homes there, you can also use that, that same network as backhaul for that Verizon tower, so that then they can put one in, and they're not having to do that all from scratch. So sometimes you can kind of piggyback these things.
That sounds encouraging. Because it's just like, we've been down this road a few times, even going back to the Tiger Grant program through ODOT. And, you know, we did our due diligence here in terms of publicly owned assets for possible tower sites and so on, and it just fell through. Plus, going back to AT&T, we made a major switch over to AT&T FirstNet with the promise that, you know, we've got X amount of towers and blah, 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 and that just never materialized, and the dead spots remained, and we started transitioning back to Verizon for that reason, since they have the superior coverage for the county overall. But it's been frustrating, but at least it sounds like a couple of possibilities.
Yeah, I completely understand the frustration. I feel it too. But yeah,
I mean, Jack
possibilities.
worked several weeks accumulating all this, and
then
Verizon hosed it within 72 hours.
And I hope you've saved all that documentation, because that'll be great for the ARC power.
Super.
Yeah. We are going to take all of these maps, and create a web version of them that we'll get the login information to Jeanette so they can share it with you. And you'll be able to, it's not too hard to use the interface, like you'll be able to go into it and essentially zoom in on parts of the county, and then all of these layers that are like on separate pages in this report, you can overlay them, and you can set them to say, like, this one's going to be half transparent so I can see through it. And so, like, you can overlay your business data on top of the residential, or you can turn on and off the color coding for the different unserved areas, just to make it easier to find. And you can pull in really close and actually see the dots, like the little points for the 911 addresses, and figure out, okay, this is the exact outline that we want. I think that will be a really powerful planning tool, and a lot easier to use than, like, flipping back and forth between the pages here and on that size too, because you can't zoom in on that, obviously. But with that web map, you'll be able to zoom in really close, and the detail will get more the closer in you go. And as soon as that's available, Omega will get it to you.
And now login information is only gonna go to our members, it's not gonna go to the public.
Excellent.
Any online questions? Well, thank you for your time, everyone. I don't feel like I'm exaggerating when I feel like this is definitely once in a generation, possibly once in a lifetime opportunity for this region with broadband. I've never seen this amount of attention paid at the federal level to this issue. But we gotta keep the pressure on them, make sure they do it and follow through. If they do follow through, this will be much like rural electrification was 100 years ago, and I think it'll bring similar change.
I'm gonna go one last question
Sure.
that I've got. Is the local match essential across the board? I wonder, what we need to be prepared for fiscally on the county's end.
Some of the programs have a matching component that's required, others don't. You will always look better if you can bring some kind of match to the table. If you don't have cash, you can also, a lot of the programs will accept like in kind. So like if you identify like the fact that if like certain parts of the county, if like a municipality owns poles or something, they can say, okay, we'll make it easier for these, like we'll facilitate connecting to these poles, or like identify like rights of way that you'll just grant to people if they're doing part of the project. That can be value, you can put a dollar value on that and make that part of the match.
Very good.
Yeah, and under the ARC Power Program, right now Guernsey County is classified as at risk, so that would be a 30% match. But in the Carroll County example that Sean provided, the match provided by the ISP counts towards that.
And a lot of these ISPs are getting more interested in smaller areas as long as it's not like a complete scattershot population. So they're looking at villages often now. Like, so you might find that like charter's willing to kick in money, matching funds simply to like for an area, because in their analysis, like, yeah, there's enough households in here. Yeah, if we get some grant money, we'll kick in X $100,000 to make it happen.
Thank you. I don't know what else to say except, because knew you were involved, obviously, and this has been an ongoing project, but to have everything drilled down that deeply is that's terrific.
Plus, we have to make sure we get service to Norm's house, right?
Yeah, exactly. Poor Norm. Yeah, I see him in that one little unfunded corner there in the lower right, so let's work on that.
One thing you might notice once you have access to the map and you're zooming in, 911 data is not perfect. We've discovered, like sometimes the point doesn't land on the person's rooftop or something. So don't be surprised, like Norm's place, if you zoom in on it really close, it might actually, like 911 might think it's over here a little ways. So don't be surprised if some of that happens. Like I actually have much greater, I've always had respect for first responders. I've got huge more respect for the post office and the 911 system now. Having seen like how the sausage is made and how the address databases look, I'm really impressed that the mail gets delivered as well as it does, and that ambulances are able to show up when somebody can't talk on the phone and they just have to use their database to find them. Like there's a lot of interesting variations in the data that they're able to work around. So I'm impressed that our system works as well as it does given the data.
That is amazing.
Any other questions, comments?
Hey, Jack, anything?
No, I know the one I'm gonna call now. Thank you.
All right, thanks, everyone.
Appreciate it.